Most people think great lawyers win because they know more law. They studied harder. They memorized more statutes. They read more cases. Wrong. The courtroom is not a memory competition. It is a cognitive warfare environment. And the best trial lawyers alive do not win because they know more. They win because they think faster, retain more accurately, read people more precisely, and construct arguments more devastatingly than anyone opposing them. Jerry Spence has never lost a criminal case in his entire career. Not one. David Boies argued Bush versus Gore before the Supreme Court and represented the United States government against Microsoft simultaneously. These people are not legal encyclopedias walking around in expensive suits. They are cognitive athletes running mental systems so precisely built that performing at the highest level of intellectual pressure becomes as reliable and repeatable as a mechanical process. I studied the training methodology, the rhetoric and logic systems underneath it, the cognitive science that explains why it works. For protocols, all of them transferable, none of them taught in school. By the end of this, you will think more clearly, argue more precisely, retain more accurately, and read people more devastatingly than you do right now. Chapter 1. The Argument Architecture. Here is the first thing a top trial lawyer does that separates them from every competent lawyer who never makes it to the elite level. They do not construct arguments. They construct structures that make opposing arguments structurally impossible. That distinction is everything. Most people think of argument as a linear process. You make a point. The other person makes a counterpoint. You make another point. Back and forth until someone runs out of points or patience. This is how amateurs argue. It is cognitively exhausting, strategically incoherent, and almost always decided by emotional energy rather than logical merit. Elite trial lawyers think about argument completely differently. Before they enter a courtroom, they have identified what they call the theory of the case. One central organizing claim from which every other element of their argument logically flows. Not 10 claims. 1. Everything else is evidence for the one claim, or it does not belong in the argument. This single theory discipline is the most difficult cognitive habit in the entire system and the most important. Human beings have a nearly universal tendency to accumulate supporting points. More evidence feels stronger. More arguments feel more persuasive. Wrong. Cognitive psychologist Jonathan Haidt at NYU spent decades studying how people actually process arguments under conditions of uncertainty and emotional investment. His conclusion is devastating for everyone who argues by accumulating points. People do not evaluate each argument independently and then sum the evaluations. They search for a reason to reject the entire argument and dismiss everything once they find one weak point. A chain of 10 arguments where one is flawed is weaker than a chain of 3 arguments where all 3 are airtight. The weak link does not just fail. It contaminates everything adjacent to it. Elite trial lawyers know this intuitively from experience and deliberately from training. They construct arguments by subtraction, not addition. Every element that is not essential to the central theory gets removed. Not because they cannot argue it, because including it creates vulnerability without adding structural strength. Jerry Spence described his preparation process as finding the one true thing and then building everything else in service of that one true thing. Not the most persuasive thing, the truest thing. Because juries, like all human beings under genuine evaluative pressure, have sophisticated unconscious detectors for claims that are constructed to persuade rather than claims that are constructed from truth. The unconscious detector fires before the conscious mind knows why. The person feels something is wrong about the argument without being able to articulate what. Your version of this works in any persuasive communication context. Before any important argument, negotiation, or persuasive presentation, identify your one central claim. Write it in one sentence. If you cannot write your central claim in one sentence, you do not have a central claim yet. You have a collection of related thoughts that have not been organized into an argument. Keep working until you have the one sentence. Then evaluate every piece of evidence, every supporting point, every example you plan to use by asking one question. Does this directly support the central claim or does it not? If it does not directly support the central claim, remove it regardless of how interesting or compelling it feels in isolation. You are not building a collection. You are building a structure. Structures derive their strength from coherence, not quantity. Now that you have the structure, Here is the second discipline that determines whether the structure actually lands or gets dismissed before the jury has consciously decided to dismiss it. Chapter 2. The Socratic Trap. Here is the most counterintuitive thing about how top trial lawyers actually change minds. They do not tell people what to think. They ask questions until people tell themselves what to think. And then the conclusion feels like the person's own idea rather than something they were persuaded into. This is not manipulation. It is the most cognitively honest form of persuasion available because it works by making the logic visible rather than by exploiting emotion or authority. Socrates figured this out 400 years ago and was executed for it because it is genuinely threatening to people whose power depends on unexamined assumptions. The Socratic method works like this. You begin with a premise your opponent accepts as obviously true. Then you ask a question whose honest answer leads logically to a second premise. Then a question whose honest answer leads to a third. You continue until the chain of honest answers arrives at a conclusion that is directly opposed to the position your opponent started with. They cannot reject the conclusion without rejecting one of their own honest answers. And they cannot reject their own honest answers without admitting they were being dishonest earlier. The trap is logical, not rhetorical. It works on intelligent people more effectively than on people who are comfortable ignoring logic, because intelligent people are more committed to the consistency of their own reasoning. David Boies is documented as one of the most effective practitioners of this technique in legal history. During the Microsoft antitrust trial, he spent days in cross-examination asking Bill Gates questions whose individually honest answers assembled into an undeniable case for anti-competitive behavior. Gates answered each question truthfully, and the answers destroyed his position. Not because Boies tricked him, because the questions made the logical structure visible that Gates had not examined before. Cognitive psychologist Richard Petty at Ohio State documented the mechanism underneath this in his elaboration likelihood model. Arguments that cause the listener to generate their own supporting reasoning produce attitude change that is more stable, more resistant to counter-persuasion, and more likely to produce behavioral change than arguments delivered as direct assertions. When you tell someone what to think, their brain's counter-argument system activates. When you ask questions that lead them to construct the conclusion themselves, the counter-argument system has nothing to push against because the argument came from inside. Your version of this is applicable in any persuasive context. Before any important conversation where you need to shift someone's position, map the logical chain from their current stated position to the conclusion you need them to reach. Identify the premises they already accept that form the intermediate steps. Then construct your questions to surface those premises in the right sequence. You are not interrogating them. You are making a logical structure visible that was already there but unexamined. When the structure becomes visible, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. And because they followed the logic themselves rather than receiving a conclusion, they own it. People defend their own conclusions far more vigorously than conclusions handed to them. Give them the questions. Let them build the answer. Hit subscribe before someone asks you a question you are not prepared for. We prepare here. Chapter 3. The Human Reader. Here is what separates a trial lawyer who wins cases from a trial lawyer who wins arguments. Winning arguments happens in the realm of logic and evidence. Winning cases happens in the realm of human psychology. And human psychology operates on signals that are almost entirely nonverbal, almost entirely unconscious, and almost entirely invisible to people who have not been specifically trained to read them. A jury does not decide a case after the closing argument. Research from psychologist Neil Vidmer at Duke Law School shows that the majority of jurors have formed a preliminary verdict within the first 20 minutes of trial. Everything that follows is evaluated through the lens of that preliminary verdict. The evidence that supports it gets weighted heavily. The evidence that contradicts it gets discounted, reinterpreted, or forgotten. This is confirmation bias operating at the group level in a high-stakes evaluative environment. Elite trial lawyers know this, which is why they invest more preparation time in jury selection and opening statements than in any other phase of the trial. The preliminary verdict forms during those windows. If it forms in your favor, the rest of the trial is largely consolidation. If it forms against you, the rest of the trial is an uphill battle against a psychological current most juries never consciously acknowledge. The human reading skill is how lawyers shape those preliminary verdicts. Here is what they are actually reading during voir dire, during opening statements, during witness examination. Not what people say. What happens to their body in the half-second before they decide what to say? Paul Ekman at UCSF spent 40 years documenting what he called microexpressions. Involuntary facial muscle movements that occur in January 25th of a second before the conscious social mask activates. These microexpressions are universal across cultures, impossible to suppress without extensive training, and directly reflect the genuine emotional response to information before the person has decided how to respond socially. A juror who says, "I can be objective about this type of case," while displaying a micro-expression of contempt when the defendant's name is mentioned, has just told you the truth about their actual position and the lie about their stated position simultaneously. Elite lawyers read both. They do not take the verbal statement as data. They take the micro-expression as data and treat the verbal statement as social performance. This is not cynicism. It is accuracy. And the accuracy is what lets them select juries that are genuinely open and remove juries that are covertly closed. Your version of this requires training a specific observational habit that most people have never developed because social convention actively discourages it. Most people look at faces for social cues about how the conversation is going. Approval, disapproval, interest, boredom. Elite human readers look at faces for the half-second window between stimulus and response. That window is where the truth lives. When you present an idea and watch the face of the person receiving it, watch the first half-second. Not the response. The reaction. The response is managed. The reaction is genuine. Does the face tighten before it opens? Does something flash across the eyes before the words arrive? That flash is information. The words that follow it are social management. Training this observational habit requires deliberate practice in low-stakes conversations before you need it in high-stakes ones. During casual interactions, make a practice of watching for the half-second pre-response window. You will begin noticing patterns. People whose faces open in that window are genuinely engaging with your idea. People whose faces tighten or flash discomfort in that window have a reaction they are managing before responding. The managed response tells you what they think you want to hear. The half-second reaction tells you what they actually think. Operate on the reaction. Adapt based on the truth, not the performance. This skill compounds over time in a way that most cognitive skills do not, because you are practicing it in every human interaction rather than in dedicated training sessions. Every conversation is a training session once you know what to watch for. Chapter 4. The Memory Palace of Facts. Here is the final protocol, and it is the one that makes everything above executable under the extreme cognitive load of a real trial or any real high-stakes performance environment. Top trial lawyers walk into a courtroom carrying thousands of case details. Witness statements, exhibit numbers, deposition transcripts, expert testimony, dates, names, contradictions, inconsistencies scattered across thousands of pages of discovery. They cannot look things up. They cannot pause to check notes without destroying the narrative flow of their examination. They need every critical fact retrievable within 2 seconds, under maximum pressure, in any order the examination demands. They achieve this not with a better natural memory, but with a constructed memory architecture called the method of loci, more commonly known as the memory palace. This is not a new technique. Cicero documented it in De Orator in 55 BC. Ancient Greek orators used it to deliver hours-long speeches without notes. It was the standard cognitive tool of educated people for over 1,000 years before writing became universally accessible and externalized the memory function. It is making a dramatic comeback in elite performance communities because the underlying neuroscience was never wrong. It was just temporarily replaced by external storage. Here is the mechanism. Human spatial memory is extraordinarily powerful compared to verbal or abstract memory. Your brain evolved to navigate physical environments with extreme precision. It can store thousands of spatial details about familiar locations with almost zero deliberate effort. The memory palace technique hijacks this spatial memory capacity to store abstract information that your brain would otherwise encode weakly and forget quickly. You construct a mental location, your childhood home, your school, a familiar route you walk regularly, with extreme vividness. You place the information you need to remember at specific locations within that mental space. but not as abstract facts, as bizarre, emotionally vivid, physically impossible images that force deep encoding through the emotional and sensory anchoring mechanisms we discussed in prior protocols. A case date of March 15th becomes a giant green Ides of March knife stabbing a calendar on your mental front door. A witness named Anderson who contradicted himself becomes a person with an Anders-sized nose pinching two opposite sides of their face simultaneously while standing in your mental hallway. The more absurd, the more vivid, the more emotionally evocative, the more deeply encoded, and the more reliably retrievable under pressure. Joshua Ford documented his training to become U.S. memory champion using this exact technique in Moonwalking with Einstein. He went from average memory to national champion in 1 year of deliberate practice. Not because his neurology changed, because he learned to use the memory architecture his brain already had. Researchers at the Radboud University in the Netherlands confirmed in a 2017 study that 6 weeks of memory palace training produced dramatic improvements in memory performance that persisted months after training ended. More importantly, brain imaging showed structural changes in connectivity between regions associated with spatial processing and regions associated with verbal memory. The training physically altered the neural architecture. This is not a parlor trick. This is a fundamental upgrade to how your memory encodes and retrieves information. Your version does not require a legal case to be worth building. Any domain where you need large amounts of information reliably accessible under pressure benefits from a memory palace. Medical students who build memory palaces for anatomical structures outperform students who use flashcards alone by margins that are not close. The technique is not harder than flashcards. It requires more imagination and more vivid encoding, which is exactly why it works better. Your brain stores vivid, emotionally activated, spatially anchored information with a completely different level of durability than it stores dry, abstract facts reviewed passively. The memory palace forces vivid encoding every time, which is why retrieval under pressure is reliable every time. Here is the final problem, though. You have 4 protocols now that top trial lawyers used to think faster, argue more precisely, read people more accurately, and retain more information under more pressure than almost anyone they face. The argument architecture, the Socratic trap, the human reader, the memory palace of facts. For tools, all backed by research from cognitive psychology, neuroscience, rhetorical theory, and legal performance science. All transferable to any domain where thinking clearly and communicating precisely under pressure determines outcomes. But here is the thing I have noticed after studying every elite cognitive performance system from lawyers to snipers to astronauts to surgeons. Every system eventually runs into the same ceiling. Not a skill ceiling, not a knowledge ceiling, an attention ceiling. All 4 protocols above require sustained, high-quality, undistracted cognitive engagement to execute. The argument architecture requires deep, uninterrupted thinking to construct. The Socratic method requires complete attention to the human in front of you to execute in real time. The human reading skill requires perceptual precision that vanishes the moment your attention fragments. The memory palace requires vivid imaginative encoding that is impossible in a distracted mental state. Every elite cognitive system in every domain eventually bottoms out at the same question. Can you actually focus deeply enough and long enough to execute the protocols you know? And the answer for most people, most of the time, in the current environment, is no. Not because of a lack of willpower, because of a lack of attentional infrastructure. That is why I made this video breaking down exactly how to rebuild your attentional infrastructure from the ground up so that every cognitive protocol you have ever learned finally has the foundation it needs to perform at the level it was designed for. Watch it next.